Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC, not BIC, BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversations, intellectual dialogue, and exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's session is Jugaad versus Shokunin, an Indian's travels in Japan. A panel of authors and travelers discuss an Indian's experience of Japan seen through Pallavi Aiyar's new book, Orienting. How is Tokyo, a city of 30 million people, so safe that 6-year-old children commute to school on their own? Why are there no trash cans in Japanese cities? Are there really 72 seasons in the country? Why are Ganesha idols in Japanese temples hidden from public view? Part travelogue, part reportage, Orienting, and by extension, this session attempts to answer questions that have long confounded the rest of the world with Aiyar's trademark humor. Tackling both the significant and the trivial, the quirky and the quotidian, here is an Indian's account of Japan that is as thought-provoking as it is charming. The speakers, along with author and journalist Pallavi Aiyar today, are political scientist and academician Pratap Bhanu Mehta, author and former parliamentarian Pawan Verma, and the session is moderated by journalist Supriya Nair. The full bios of the speakers will appear at the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share with the speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box also at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and the speakers will get to it towards the end of the session. And with that, over to Supriya.
Hello. Hi, everyone who's listening, and thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists for being here. And congratulations, Pallavi, on writing one of those terrifically charming books I think many people have had the chance to read this year. Certainly got me out of my pandemic funk, having not left my neighborhood in about 18 months. This was very charming, and it reminded me, above everything else, this sounds so simple, of how much of our lives are actually lived in between the covers of books and how much we discover of the world through that. Of course, part of the fun of this was also kind of this sort of sparkling immediacy of your writing about this place, not simply as a foreign correspondent, but as a resident, as an explorer, as an adventurer of sorts. Thank you very much for that. I want to introduce the book, but I thought our audience might also appreciate an introduction from and to hear from each of our speakers. So before we talk specifically about Orienting, I wondered if I could bring you all in about the subject of our talk, Japan, and about your own personal relationships with Japan, whether they're artistic, diplomatic, political, as they may be. For me, my introduction to Japan came as a college student through the novels of foreigners, in fact, of Pico Iyer and the British writer David Mitchell. Was that also true for you, Pallavi? Did you discover Japan through books?
So Japan was really under-discovered for me before I moved there in 2016. I knew quite a lot about its giant neighbor, China, having lived there for several years in the first decade of this millennium. And I had then subsequently spent several years in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia as well. And I was from India. So I had this sense of being an Asianist, but Japan was very much sort of a missing part of this Asian jigsaw. And when I learned that we'd be moving there, I think it was in the summer of 2016, I had to really confront the fact about how little I knew about this place that was going to be home for the next few years. And I tried to sort of process and dredge up from my memories what it was that I really associated with Japan, and realized I had a very vague sense, on the one hand of Japanese rampaging across the continent with bayonets, and on the other with Walkmans, and snatches of pop songs, perhaps. There was big in Japan in the 1980s. There was a Simon and Garfunkel song, Kodachrome. I have a Nikon camera. I want to take a photograph. Oh, mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. So that was kind of the oral backdrop to, when the news was announced to me that here we are, and we're going to be moving there. I remember reaching out to the hive mind on social media and asking for suggestions about what I should be reading, and being inundated with suggestions from Tanazaki and Soseki and Kawabata and Mishima, Dasai, Endo. Later, I realized that a substantial portion of these writers had actually ended up committing suicide. So that was a kind of fertile vein for exploration later. But I gathered all of these books. I began to, make my way through them. I think one thing that had always attracted me about Japan were haiku, and that was something I was quite familiar with. So I'd been a fan of the greats, Basho and Issa for many years. And I had also read a lot of Murakami. Unfortunately, reading Murakami can often obfuscate more than clarify. So I wasn't, again, really sure what to expect from that. And then the other thing I started doing was learning the language. I thought I should get a head start on that. So while I was still in Jakarta, I hired a Japanese teacher, and I found it quite bewildering because, for a month, I remember learning essentially how to say thank you. And there was arigato, which meant thank you. There was arigato gozaimasu, which meant thank you. There was domo arigato gozaimasu, which meant thank you. There was domo sumimasen, arigato gozaimasu, which also meant thank you. And at the end of all of this, my teacher told me about yoroshiko onegaishimasu. And I said, what does that mean? And she was like, well, it really means thank you. And so I realized that, had a month's worth of Japanese lessons, and essentially learned how to say thank you at the end of it. But it was, I was aware that it was going to be a great privilege to go to Japan, because it was in many ways such an anomaly in Asia. It was on the geographic edge of it. It seemed to be something of Asia, but also something outside Asia. And it was so different from the other Asian megalopolises that I had been used to, all of which had this kind of upward thrust of commerce and people. But Japan was kind of, it was older, it was quieter, it was more polite, it was more stable. It was rule obsessed rather than loophole hungry, which kind of brings us back perhaps to the Jugaad Shokunin dichotomy that this talk is also setting up. So, I knew it was going to be a very different flavor, but perhaps not completely different, something familiar and something different. This very interesting hybrid of something that had a resonance for me as an Asian, as an Indian, as somebody who knew China, but at the same time, something that was not Asian. And I think that indeed proved to be the case. And it was really one of the inspirations for writing the book, to try to get those multiple contradictions and impressions across.
Yeah, one of the many things I loved about Orienting was how personal you made the perhaps, or as some may consider it, hoary old idea of Asianism that goes beyond Belt and Road. Pratap and Pavan, might I bring you in here with just this like breezy personal question about your own familiarity and relationship with Japan? Pratap, perhaps if you'd like to go first.
First of all, congratulations to Pallavi for writing a really terrific book. And I think it's really kind of overachievement to write a great book on China and a great book on Japan. So that's really extraordinary, and on Europe as well. But
right, and reporting brilliantly from Indonesia,
and lots of other
in the middle of it.
I think of my own personal relationship to Japan, I think three very different contexts. I mean, one's frankly two very strong friendships when I was studying in the United States. One with somebody who was actually Japanese, and another scholar who had spent lots of time in Japan as a scholar, and really kind of sort of endless discussions about Japan. I mean, those were kind of tutorials, as it were. I visited Japan about 5 times, but I'm the opposite of Pallavi in some senses, terrible at languages, find it very difficult to get around in the way that she does, in the inventive way that she does in some senses. And I suppose if you're vegetarian and don't drink, like half the culture kind of just closes itself on you. So I'm not sure those travels were very insightful in terms of what I learned about Japan. But the two other contexts, which is one was actually our children. I mean, I mean, Pallavi knows this and would love to hear kind of what Pallavi's kids' reactions were to Japan. But Doraemon, Nobita, and Kitrestu were like sort of pervasive presences in children's lives, and it kind of always went back to this interesting question of Japan as kind of part of this kind of global technological imagination of the future. I mean, these kind of sort of, and the third context, I think, was much more academic, which is that, for much of the 20th century, it's been the kind of mystery case in terms of what kind of Asian modernization would be possible. I mean, there've been waves of it. I mean, of course, Japan was the first country to kind of modernize in some senses. Many thought westernize in a very particular kind of way. Then the 50s, 60s, you had this discourse of kind of, Japan as a kind of alternative economic model in some senses, a real kind of model of organizing an economy that's very different. By the late 1980s, you had kind of Japan as number one and sort of, Japanese capitalism displacing an American style capitalism. And then this kind of contemporary moment, which is, I think, wonderfully captured in Pallavi's book. Some of it is Japan as a kind of end of history nation in some senses, a kind of what a possible, future might look like. So, in that context of global history, I think Japan has always been fascinating.
Absolutely. And at a time when India itself is now talking again of models, economic models imported perhaps forcefully from the East, not from Japan, but from China and Korea. We hear, the words tribal capitalism come up again and again. It's all the more interesting to think back to a history in which this was a looming question for many. Pallavi, I would love for you to give our dozens of viewers a sense from the book. I have a favorite bit which I requested, but yes, but it's not necessary that you stick to that. But I actually think it'll kind of go nicely with what Pratap said.
Why not? Why not? It has to do with Tagore's visit to Japan in 1916, I think, and then my subsequent sort of retracing his steps a little bit. I'll try to keep it short as well. Yeah, I thought I had marked it, but it seems to have. Okay. And I need to wear my glasses as well in order to read. Okay. The consequences of the links forged between India and Japan during the Pan-Asian movement were complex and not always salubrious. They blended anti-colonial idealism with Japan's right-wing propaganda for the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, providing intellectual justification for the imperial army's misadventures in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia during the Second World War. Asia's first Nobel laureate, the poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore, was wary of this tendency years before Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. During his maiden voyage to Japan in 1916, he'd expressed an increasing discomfort with Japan's drift towards belligerent nationalism. At a celebrated speech at Keio University in Tokyo, he'd warned against imitating Europe's tendency to, quote, imbue the minds of a whole people with an abnormal vanity of its own superiority, to teach it to take pride in its moral callousness and ill-begotten wealth. But the Indian poet had also been impressed with Japan's intimacy with nature, for which he was full of praise. Quote, you have known nature's language of lines and music of colors, the symmetry in her irregularities, and the cadence in her freedom of movements. Japan needed to be reminded, he said, that its strength lay in its genius for simplicity, love for cleanliness, immense reserve of force in self-control. He acknowledged that his sentiments might seem impractical, Yet, when standing on the outskirts of Yokohama, I watched the sunset in your southern sea and saw its majesty among your pine-clad hills. The music of eternity welled up through the evening silence, and I felt that the sky and the earth and the lyrics of the dawn and the dayfall are with the poets and idealists, he concluded. The moment I read these words, I knew I needed to stand on the spot where Tagore had heard eternity's music. But the Yokohama I was familiar with was a bustling satellite city of Tokyo, known mostly for its Chinatown, shopping malls, and baseball stadium. Research revealed that Tagore had spent 3 months in the city's Sankhyan Gardens as the guest of a wealthy silk merchant and tea master. It was while he lodged at the gardens that Tagore wrote the public speeches he gave in Japan, refining his attempts at developing a language to express the amalgamation of the universalism that was close to his heart with the particular Asian accents that he was also taken with. Having discovered all this, I'd hurried to arrange a visit to the Sankhyan Gardens and walk in Tagore's hallowed footsteps. And so it was that I found myself shivering lightly in anticipation and cold as I took in the gardens on an early December morning with Toshikazu Yoshikawa, manager of the Sankhyan Foundation. We walked up a bluff to survey what remained of the shofukaku, or the pavilion of wind-swept pines, the house that Tagore had lived in. The structure had been badly damaged in a 1923 earthquake, and only a small section of it remained. The ocean view that Tagore had referred to in his Keio University lecture had not weathered the passing of time, as well as the gardens themselves. Concrete buildings and construction cranes crowded the horizon. And yet, the breeze that blew our hair askew held a poem in it. For a moment, I felt a haiku dance on my lips, but luckily for Yoshikawa-san, the moment passed and he was saved from having to be polite. From Tagore's speeches in Japan, it was evident that he had sensed the contradictions at the heart of modern Japanese identity. For Japan was both at ease and profoundly uncomfortable in its own skin, desirous of forging a different path to those of European colonialists, while admiring and imitating their agency and power. Sentiments of solidarity coexisted with those of superiority towards the rest of Asia. Japan's ontology was not clear to itself, a condition that arguably persisted today. Who am I? What should I do about it? These questions remained unanswered, in part because they were never articulated clearly, drowned in the chaos of confronting modernity, waging war, and the jingoism of Nihon Jinron. Nihon Jinron is a sort of genre of writing by Japanese about Japan, trying to explain why it's so unique. Anyway, I leave it at that, Supriya.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. And I immediately have a dozen questions that I want to ask you, but I also, I feel like this might be a good opportunity to bring in Pavan. Thank you for rejoining us, sir. This is clearly a history that you are familiar with as a writer, as an intellectual, as a diplomat. And I suppose the rather bold question I might have as an outsider is, in how much does this sentiment of solidarity and this deeply moving and rich intellectual history matter if you are a politician or a policy maker today rather than a philosopher?
Well, let me also begin by first congratulating Pallavi for a book which I found quite fascinating and brave. I say brave because essentially cultures are opaque. And however much a foreigner seeks to unravel them, is very resilient. One of the arguments I make in one of my own books called Becoming Indian is that this great myth of a global village, thanks to globalization, doesn't really sustain or the myth that we have all become clones of each other. Cultures are very different. And to get under their surface and their skin in a manner that is revelatory, it may be from a foreigner's point of view, is a difficult task. And I congratulate Pallavi, and this is why I enjoyed the book in the first place, that she gets quite successfully under the skin of a very complex, nuanced, ancient, historical culture and its people, both in terms of its past and its present day dynamics. So, in that sense, this book is important, even if the task was difficult. Uh, Obviously, with Japan, we share some of the Asia Connect, but I would believe that we have the same connect with China also, and yet there are substantial differences in worldview and realpolitik and national aspirations of both countries so as to lead to conflict. With Japan, tend to suspect that there is a greater mutual admiration for each other as two ancient cultures. I don't know, I want to ask Pallavi if the Japanese are impatient with Indians for not really being as efficient as they are. My own experience about the Japanese uh, is limited. I have not been posted there as a diplomat, but I have visited there more than once, both as a diplomat and as a parliamentarian. I remember on one of my first visits, Pallavi, uh, there was an attendant at the airport, and my natural tendency was to leave a tip until somebody whispered in my ear that you don't tip in Japan. And this kind of work ethic came as a complete surprise. I don't know if I'm right, but there are no tips.
No.
And secondly, as it so happened in my house in Delhi, I had two successive Japanese tenants. And I can share with you that one day I was watching one of them in the drive of his house. He lived in a 4-bedroom house, which was much larger, I assume, than he would have in Japan, where, it may be one of the most expensive capitals of the world, but the quality of life is not entirely comparable very often with the comforts that come so cheaply in India. So he had this chauffeur driven car. Another minion took out his golf clubs and put them in the car. Somebody had made him breakfast, a third minion, and he walked out and sat in the car in the back seat and drove to the golf course and came back in a chauffeur driven car and then went to work. And since he also became a friend, he was telling me this kind of lifestyle would be impossible in Japan. So I really want to ask you this question. How often did you find this opacity very stubborn? And what were the instrumentalities as an author and observer that you used to overcome it, at least to the extent that you could? This is a question that fascinates me. Uh, I once knew an American married into my family who went for a haircut in Delhi. And when he came back, he said, it was very nice, except that towards the end of it, they began to beat up my head, which was our
The
form
chapti.
of the champi, and he couldn't understand it at all. Cultures can be so different. Uh, I was in America and meeting a very dear friend who was an American, and when we sat down for lunch, it was his invitation, and the waiter came and said, separate bills, and he said, yes, which seemed to me very odd because the tendency in India, not that we are not also miserly occasionally, is that you take a friend and you pay for a lunch. So these are the differences in culture, and these cultures can be absolutely mind boggling. So I want to really ask you this question, that did you go with a mission? Were you looking for just those crevices by which you could unravel this culture? Did they come to you as a sudden revelation one morning as you looked at the sun? What is this process like?
Yeah. Supriya, may I? Um, I will answer your question, but before that, I also want to allude to something you said earlier, which was that it's quite brave to write about another culture. Brave or foolhardy, I'm not sure which is a better adjective, because I do know, that to write a nation, to explain it, is almost ridiculous, particularly if you are trying to kind of claim any kind of authority. I think a more honest claim is one that admits to bewilderment and to delight, to intuition and to hunches, and is essentially comprised of, vignettes and snatches of coherence that you gain through the process of inhabiting a new culture, a new place. And I also think it's quite important to make your work also not just about the place you are writing or observing, but about yourself and situating yourself within the book, because what you end up doing is revealing as much about who you are, you as the observer, your own subjective, predilections, your own background, as much as you are about the place that you are talking about. And it needs to be honest in putting yourself forward there, so that readers can also see my own failings as an observer. For example, I never learned to speak Japanese very fluently, and if I did, it's very possible I would have written a different book or chosen different kinds of topics, or even arrived at different conclusions. But I also think that as an Indian and as a writer, I'm quite comfortable with the multiplicity of truths, and so I do feel I've written a truth. It is one of many, and there might be others. There might even be some that are quite contradictory to what I've written, but that doesn't take away from what I've written either. And as for the process, I think I try to firstly have few preconceptions as far as that's possible. In the case of Japan, it was possible because I just didn't know very much. I spend about the first year, I think, in any new country, really with my eyes open, in the sense that I'm drinking in everything that I'm looking at. It takes about a year in any new place before that place starts becoming normalized and therefore a little bit translucent or even opaque. But in that first year, you tend to actually read street signs. When you are sitting in the metro, you look at what the adverts are saying. When you see somebody sitting next to you reading a book, you kind of peer over to see what the title of the book is. You try and pick up snatches of conversation, even if you don't understand the language, for the body language, for the tone, for the way in which intimacy is exchanged or not. So I think, it's a time, the first 6 months or 1 year in a place, where all your senses as an observer are very open, and I kind of try to cultivate that openness to really drink in as much as possible. And then I supplement that as much as possible with deep reading. My interests tend to be more on the sort of aesthetic and literary side rather than on the political or economic side. But I tend to read fiction, I tend to read literary nonfiction, poetry. I go to museums. I try to understand the sort of artistic, aesthetic culture of the place. And then, my day job, what kind of pays the bills, is that I'm a reporter. So perforce, I end up meeting a large range of people and interviewing them. And, as my job, I get to ask them questions. I think one other rich vein for me is that of my children, because I am also a mother. And I think in every country I've lived in, the mothers and fathers, but more the mothers of other children, and the school environment, and the kind of quotidian everyday life of meeting with Japanese people through the children is also very helpful in constructing a sense of what that society is like, what the values are, what the problems are, and often leads to very different conclusions to if you were just to sit down and read like a non-fiction tome on it by a pundit. So, it's a variety of different things. There's no one strategy, but I don't usually set out to write a book. I set out to learn about a place and then see whether something emerges at the end of it all or not.
I think this answer really demonstrates with a very light touch just how much hard work went into writing a book that is the opposite of hard work to read. And over again, I'm just, as a journalist, seeing every dispatch and every chapter and the kind of work that goes into it, it just, consistently wowed me. Thank you for that. But you called the book Orienting, which is also, I think, it's very you, it's very tongue in cheek, and I wonder if that was your acknowledgement of obviously the fun of being a foreign correspondent, but also very much sort of the limits of it.
Right, because I mean, it's a pun, right? I mean, Japan is of the Orient. Orienting is navigating and finding your way. And I'm a stranger in a foreign country, orienting myself. But it is also a nod and an acknowledgement to Orientalism and the fact that so much of what we have learned about, not only Japan, but ourselves, I mean, as objects of the Orientalist gaze, I think we have, it's been quite insidious, and we've internalized a lot about ourselves through the writings of others. And this is true for the Japanese as well. If you look at Nihon Jinron, which was that genre of writing I was referring to earlier, which is essentially very popular in Japan. It's a genre which tries to explain the uniqueness of Japan, why Japan is not like anywhere else. And it can go to some ridiculous extremes, including the Japanese brain and how they are more left-brained than right-brained, and therefore more attuned with nature than normal people. There's even somebody who wrote a book about how cicadas and insects sound different to the Japanese brain than other people. I mean, that is like, okay, a more extreme version of it. But I think foreigners have long romanticized Japan. There has been the sort of European, the American, who has lived in Japan and kind of fallen in love with its aesthetics and aestheticized it greatly. And then, it ends up becoming something that the Japanese have ended up also internalizing and begin sort of to analyze themselves within that same framework. So it's almost a framework that's very difficult to break out of. I mean, I myself found Japan deeply aesthetic. I myself found myself almost sort of seeing it through the views of, D.T. Suzuki and his seminal tome on Zen, which was accused of being very Orientalist in the ways that he tried to describe Zen to outsiders. So it's a difficult trap to really step out of. But I wanted to, like I said, I tried to foreground all these issues. I haven't solved them, but I'm aware of them.
Pallavi, was there a process of comparison as an almost parallel accompaniment to your discoveries? Were you comparing, or were you autonomously examining this culture?
Always comparing. And I think that we compare naturally, whether we are aware of it or not. Whatever we observe is analyzed and interpreted against a kind of implicit norm. Whatever you see, whether you see the traffic in Beijing, whether you think the traffic in Beijing is incredibly disciplined and the drivers drive like robots, that usually means that your implicit norm is Indian traffic or traffic in Bangalore. If you look at that traffic in Beijing and think that they're crazy drivers who don't know any norms, your implicit norm is German traffic, right? So, I mean, any observer, any kind of analysis that you're coming with is a act of comparison. And I have many axes of comparison because I have spent 20 years living in so many different countries, and I feel it's an accretive process, so that when I'm sort of looking at Japan, I'm not just looking at it through my Indian lenses, but through my Chinese lenses, through my Indonesian lenses, through my European lenses as well. And I feel that it's quite fertile, actually, if you start looking at things in a comparative framework rather than
you don't find it an obstruction.
No, I find it helpful. I find it very helpful, actually, in also normalizing things, because I think we tend to pathologize when we are not familiar with a wide enough range of points of comparison.
And did you overcompensate in your attempt to try and give the culture its due? Do you think you overcompensated?
I don't think so. I think, if anything...
As a reader, I don't think you did.
These things interest me as an author myself.
Right.
And as a diplomat, being an observer of so many countries and cultures, these are often pitfalls where you become particularly conscious of necessarily understanding and contextualizing what may otherwise appear to be discordant.
That's true. Supriya.
Or Pavan, what you're saying reminds me of one of the things I found most fascinating, and that took me a little time to wrap my head around in the early parts of Pallavi's book, which is that she compares her ease of being able to kind of live and slip into Japanese life unfavorably with China. And for someone like me who has only kind of an academic familiarity with both, I would have thought it would be the opposite. But now, but do you think, and perhaps I can throw this question out to all of you and your experiences, intellectual and otherwise, is the fact that for all our differences with China, that we're both like large, teeming, heterodox and heterogeneous societies, is that what kind of helps make the connection a bit more visceral?
Who would you like to answer that, Supriya?
Pallavi, as author, I would like you to have the privilege of going first.
I mean, it depends on each individual, I think. I was also in China at a particular time in my life, footloose and fancy-free, no kids. I was able to learn the language, which I was not able to with any felicity, at least with Japanese. And I think that made a huge difference in my engagement with China. But also China is closer to India. Like you pointed out, it is chaotic, it is loophole hungry. Chinese are quite direct. They want to ask you about, why aren't you married? How many kids do you have? How much do you earn? I mean, they're very upfront. And the Chinese language is also a very direct language, whereas the Japanese are very wrapped up. There's a lot more sort of repression and stuffing things back almost rather than coming out with it. It's indirect linguistically, it's indirect culturally. So it can be more difficult to access. But what I talked about in the initial parts of the book was actually comparing it to settling down in Jakarta. And what was interesting was the technological ease of settling down in a developing Southeast Asian country like Jakarta versus the technological difficulties of settling down in what we seem to think of as a techno utopia, Japan. At least that's our image of it. In the global imagination, it's very futuristic. But in fact, the digital revolution seems to have passed Japan by, or it's hovering around it, but hasn't in any way descended on it. So for example, things like opening a bank account, being able to pay with a credit card in a shop. I mean, very basic, simple things were very complicated. Using a taxi app, it was very analog. And I think that kind of became very clear also during the COVID pandemic, when suddenly they had to start working from home, and also education had to go online. And it was appalling. My children went to an international school and the online switch took about a week. But for Japanese kids going to Japanese schools, for the first 3 months, the schools would post worksheets by Japan Post to their home, where mothers, almost always mothers, had to sit and mark them and then post them back to the teachers, who would then phone the mothers and talk to them about it on the telephone. I mean, this was ridiculous when, my children were sitting in front of a screen and just doing their normal classes on Zoom. We saw that with telemedicine. We saw that people were not being able to work from home because many people did not have internet connections at home. It turned out that as many people had fax machines. A third of Japanese families still have fax machines at home than had internet connections. So a lot was revealed about the sort of state of techno Japan, I think, by the pandemic as well. And the contrast with somewhere like Indonesia, which was so digital and so advanced, and all the sort of, startups and everything that were coming out of it was quite stark.
Not being able to pay for things through your phone now seems weird and a thing of the past. Pratap, I wonder if I might bring you in on that. And, again, to put it extremely broadly so that you can interpret it as you like. Large, heterogeneous, heterodox society versus small, incredibly, ethnically homogeneous society. How to build bridges.
So I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, one, I kind of share Pallavi's assessment. I mean, I'm talking of a very limited space, let's say universities, and certainly before Xi Jinping came to power, I actually used to feel much more home in Chinese institutions than Japanese ones.
Mm.
In Japan, you were always kind of worried about sort of small formalisms. If you gave a seminar, there was a kind of very clear hierarchy of who spoke when, sort of, who was asked to speak. Whereas, in a sense, being on a Chinese campus was actually like being on a university campus anywhere. I mean, particularly the top universities, if you were at Beda or Tsinghua, I mean, so long as you were not sort of, bashing up in the Communist Party, it was actually felt like pretty much being anywhere else. I think it's more than, look, I mean, Japan is also a big country. I mean, when we say small, yes, in comparison to India and China, but it's not small in terms of population. Of course, it's more homogeneous, but I think one of the interesting things, I think, is the premium on presenting itself as homogeneous, right? I mean, that's one of the things that Pallavi touches on. And it can take extreme lengths, right? So one is kind of disguising the origins of things. I mean, friends of mine in Japan tell me that, even when Korean artists sometimes perform in Japan these days, there's kind of, you have to sort of present them as almost kind of quasi sort of Japanese. So I think one of the interesting things is not so much the literal fact of homogeneity, but the investment in a certain kind of self-image of that sort of homogeneity, which does seem to be, I think a little bit distinctive and I think stronger in Japan. I mean, China, for all kind of stuff, even communist China likes to stage its diversity. It's orchestrated, it's staged. But so I think that's one I think issue. I think the second thing, which again, Pallavi, I think in some senses, touches upon, which is this whole question of kind of the relationship with tradition, right? And the investment that relationship somehow manifests itself in some form of ritual. I mean, that's in some senses what ritual is, right? At one level. I mean, it's continuity through repetition in some senses. And I think one of the interesting things, I mean, I'm just going out on a limb here since we are being sort of speculative. I think when in China, you think of discourses of continuity, at least now in the contemporary sense, it's a much more sort of abstract, politicized conception of continuity than this kind of investment in sort of, continuity through repetition almost, as if, breaking some kind of norm of repetition would create a kind of big rupture. I mean, if you visit, Chinese monuments as opposed to kind of Japanese ones. So I think it's also a very different conception of sort of rites and ritual in some senses. And at one level, that gives Japan a certain kind of depth and fascination, at least this presentation of kind of continuity through a sort of perfectly ordered symmetry and repetition. But it also makes it much more closed and inaccessible.
Right. And what you say, Pratap, reminds me of something where Pallavi kind of like, I think, in my opinion, undersold the work that she does in this book, where she talks about her own inclinations as aesthetic and literary rather than political and economic. Because in fact, the challenge of doing political and economic work between nations, between societies, between companies is something you do address in the book, because this is something you reported on while you lived in Japan. And I want to talk about that, but I want to. But I feel like we're sufficiently warmed up to bring up something else that your book really made me think about, which is migration. We meet some fascinating people through your book. We learn about this society's conflicted relationship with outsiders coming in and their ideas about assimilation and integration, all of which naturally are set for us in opposition to how we think big liberal democracies deal with these questions. But of course, your book appears in a time when the two biggest liberal democracies in the world today, have notably been shoving people into camps, into transit camps, and I wondered if you could dwell a little bit, Pallavi, on
Yes.
what the future looks like in a place like Japan and what that might say for us in the rest of the world.
It's a tricky one because because Japan is a rich country, and most other rich countries have become in some way or the other open to immigration because immigrants want to go to rich countries. But unlike the rest, it has remained almost resolutely anti-immigrant. Only 2% of its population is foreign born. And if you look at political asylum figures, they're really hysterical. I think they're taken about 10 to 15 people a year on that sort of political asylum quota. The argument, of course, is that we are this very homogenous society, and to let foreigners in would then lose the Japanese character, like what it is that makes Japan Japan. But to be honest, if you kind of go far back enough, Japan is a country of immigrants. The Japanese did not drop into the archipelago from the sun god, which is their origin myth. At least I don't think. A lot of research shows that they came from Korea, basically, and from China. That's where the majority of the Yaoi people came in, from Korea, and then you have the Ainu from the north. So I mean, Japanese have come from elsewhere, of course, over the millennia, over centuries, because they are an archipelago. There was even a period when they were completely closed off under the Tokugawa to outside influences, and they have developed quite a unique, quite a homogeneous culture. But as Pratap pointed out earlier, also some of this is constructed. Within Japanese society, there are many divisions. You have people of Korean ethnicity, you have people of Chinese ethnicity, you have the Buraku, who were essentially the equivalents of India's Dalits, who were a group of people that, like India's Dalits, were confined to certain polluting occupations. There was very little intermarriage between them and other Japanese. They had to live in certain designated geographical spaces. And you have other kinds of immigrants today as well. You have people from Southeast Asia who are increasingly coming in. You have people from Nepal, from Bangladesh. So, things are changing because of Japan's demographic problem. I mean, ultimately, you've got a country that is growing so old that it is facing a massive crunch, a demographic crunch. And there's actually a debate about whether we should have more immigrants to solve the demographic crunch or more robots. And it's actually framed like that, robots or immigrants. But so far, I don't think the robots are winning. It's the immigrants who are winning. All the I was taken to various elderly care homes, for example, to look at all the robots that they've developed to assist and replace human nurses. And none of them were very successful. And all the people who were asked preferred human beings to the robots when it came to being assisted in terms of bed transfers or being lifted up, pushed. So, I mean, they have realized that. And even Abe, under the former Prime Minister Abe, who's quite conservative, there was an opening up, a slight liberalization of the immigration policy. And we are now seeing more and more, in particular, Southeast Asian immigrants who are being allowed in for a certain number of years. That said, I mean, to say that immigration or uncontrolled immigration is a boon or a bonus, I don't think that's true either. And after having spent all my years living in Europe and seeing the complete mess over here that happened with them letting in guest workers in the 1960s and 70s and thinking that they would all go home, and then they didn't, and essentially now having ghettos and having a lot of social, cultural, religious strife and problems that have resulted from developing multicultural societies and that do not have any clear resolutions. I kind of understand that, Japan, that is this incredibly safe, secure, and does have a defined sense of what its culture is about, would be wary about just following that model, and particularly seeing how polarized societies are getting in the West today. So, I mean, the thing about immigrants is that they bring in dynamism, they bring in growth. But at the same time, it can also be a difficult social process. And the Chinese and the Japanese have, they have certain ways in which they've done things. Flexibility is not necessarily their strong suit. So there are genuine concerns over there, which make it a confounding question, not one that has an easy answer.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And I would encourage our listeners to read your book to see how honestly you tackle this question, and you tell us about how the Japanese are tackling this question. We have about 10 minutes to go. And it would be very, very unfair of me to continue to ask my questions instead of opening this up to the audience. So allow me to do that. And perhaps this is something on which, again, all three of you can comment briefly.
Priya,
Yes, Pallavi.
since I have another engagement, I'll take leave now.
Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Question and answer. And let me then again congratulate Pallavi, say hello to Pratap, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me say I remain admirer both of the young lady and of the book. Thank you so much.
So much. I really appreciate that. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege and pick at random. I'm looking for women's names in this.
So not so random, Supriya.
No, not at all, in fact. Suman Berry asks, what impression did you form of gender roles within Japanese families given the access your children provided?
So traditional gender roles are quite common. And because of that, we're seeing less and less marriage. We're seeing many women choosing not to have children, which is sort of adding to the demographic woes. But I think the biggest problem in Japan is really the culture of overwork in general. And they have the sort of work culture is so antiquated that it does not allow anybody to have a dual role, i.e. be somebody who's part of the workforce and also have a personal life. So perforce, it kind of leads to this segregation of gender roles. And I do have to say that I have a sort of maybe counterintuitive take on Japanese women, which is that if I had to choose, if by some cosmic twist of fate I could choose, I would rather be a Japanese woman than a Japanese man. And I think many people are surprised by that because the idea is that, oh, you know, there's a lot of gender discrimination, women have a tough time, so on, which is all true. Basically, it is difficult for women to rise in the workforce beyond a certain level. More than 70% of Japanese women do work, which is much higher than the average globally. But the problem is that they tend to work at lower rungs, right? It's hard for them to move up because the more you move up, the more time you essentially need to dedicate to your work. But to be honest, I think they end up having far more rounded lives in which they can take their kids to school, watch a movie, go out for lunch, and think about life, read a book, than the average Japanese salaryman who's really trapped on a kind of treadmill of long commutes, being paid to essentially just sit there at sheer boredom for hours and hours and hours, waiting for the boss to go home first, sometimes being forced by the boss in the evening to then go drinking, sometimes to the point of throwing up whether or not they actually want to drink. And then it being too late, missing the last train back home, stumbling back to the office, going to sleep in the dormitory over there, and then pressing this on repeat, taking possibly 3 or 4 days of leave for the entire year. I think the life of the salary man is truly a joyless one.
That comes through, although you don't write about it in very great detail, that really does come through in what you write about, like home life in Orienting. I'm going to ask Suchin Majumdar's question, and Pratap, I'm going to ask you to come in here first because this might be something that you've thought about. How would you explain the quest for perfection in Japanese culture? The fact that good is not enough. I'm not sure if that's true. That there is art in, sweets or paper string craft, and that there's profundity in putting quality ahead of speed.
This is an interesting question. I mean, I don't know whether Pallavi would agree with this, right? But because one of the sort of the paradoxes of Japanese culture, right? So at one level, there is a kind of lot of perfection, at least in technology, in ritual, in the aesthetics. I mean, just the kind of the visual presentation of food, for example. I mean, absolute like literally work of art, even in actually pretty ordinary sort of places, right? On the other hand, right, one of the interesting things about Zen Buddhism was this whole question that you have to be able to give meaning to literally any arbitrary point. I mean, it's actually, in some senses, the opposite of perfection, because perfection is a kind of instrumentalization of yourself, right? It's an instrumentalization of every moment. This moment is in the aid of something else. And so one of the interesting things about Japan is this kind of complete paradox, right? That at one level, as Pallavi was describing in terms of work routines, in terms of, sort of labor productivity, a real complete whole-scale instrumentalization of society. And yet, again, that's kind of self-conception that actually, in fact, you're not supposed to paint fully bloomed flowers, for example, apparently in certain motifs of Japanese art. I mean, precisely because, in some senses, both beauty and meaning could be found in every single moment. So I think it's actually a pretty paradoxical kind of relationship to, I think perfectionism in some ways. But even on the technological side, I mean, one of the things we've learned, I think, in retrospect, that a lot of the kind of myth about it, and not the myth, but the sense that Japan would triumph. Japan actually turned out to be more like other nations than we realized. I mean, this whole thing that Japanese technology would necessarily dominate, Japanese corporations have perfected practices. In fact, in some senses, ultimately, look, capitalism does take over, no matter how hard culture and organizational forms resist. And I think you see some of those same dynamics at work in Japan as well.
Right, a culture that was, completely obsessed with perfectionism would not have all the concepts for sadness and longing that I think the Japanese have gifted us. Pallavi, do you have thoughts about
I think
this?
the nail on the head in many ways. And I do think that there is something to do with Zen, which imbues Japan, even if it's not something that's very conscious in people's minds, just as most sort of civilizational influences are often sort of sublimated. And I think it's that, the perfection, it's not, I wouldn't call it perfectionism, because as Pratap said, perfectionism seems to imply a goal. Whereas I think the whole Japanese repetitiveness is not about reaching a particular goal. The goal will always be elusive. Perfection is elusive. That does not take away, though, from the kind of many repetitive acts that you are doing that are along that journey. So the journey is the important part. It's not really the end goal as such. I mean, the famous painter Hokusai, who did the Great Wave of Kanagawa, he epitomized it. He was on his deathbed when he was 95 years old and had been painting for gazillions of years and churning out, all kinds of celebrated wood blocks. And he was asked if he had any regrets. And he said, oh, if only heaven gave me 5 more years, I might actually paint something like a beautiful picture. So, I mean, that it's kind of that sense that with Zen, the goal does not actually matter. It's the path of getting there.
And I think the sense that this is entirely absent from Indian culture is perhaps I think
that's hard.
I don't think that's entirely true, because the first thing that comes to mind is music, right? Our musicians would find what Hokusai said very familiar. You get to 70 and then you're like, oh, finally, I'm ready to sing this rag. We're very close to having to call time out, but I am going to ask both of you one more question. Do you think that China's economic success, like Japan's, will peter out sooner than we think? The rest of the question, one asks about Confucian work ethic as an advantage, which I think is perhaps limiting. So let me just ask you both that very broadly. Will China's economic success, like Japan's, peter out sooner than?
I don't think China's economic success is going to peter out very quickly. And just to frame it in the Jugaad Shokunin terms, I actually think China is a very happy medium of Jugaad and Shokunin, which gives it a huge advantage. It has the sort of practical mentality. It has the flexibility to deal with changing dynamics in many ways, but at the same time, it also is very process oriented and has this kind of repetitive ways of working and discipline that we've seen in Confucian cultures before as well. I mean, Xi Jinping, it's difficult to know, because if you had asked me this question before Xi Jinping, I would have said we have a long way to go. I think he's actually creating a more difficult situation for China in some ways. But to put it very quickly, I do not think that it's going to be petering out in the short or even medium term.
I actually agree with Pallavi entirely. I mean, I think in fact, in some senses, you'll probably see a kind of new wave of innovation. I mean, that doesn't mean there's not going to be conflict or turmoil. I mean, this could be a pretty rocky road. But I think there is a kind of critical mass of sophistication. I think also that ability in some sense of the society to do both things. I mean, both be extremely individualistic at one hand and yet kind of sort of move lock, stock and barrel, move like the Titanic around if something goes wrong. I think the capacity to adapt, we'll see. I think a lot of it. And frankly, I don't think it's a society. I mean, it's encumbered by a political closeness of a certain kind, but it's actually not encumbered by pretty much anything else. I mean, it looks back only to move forward, not to sort of say, this past is a kind of encumbrance that ties us, and in some senses we have to be. So I do think you will see a lot of sort of dynamism still in China.
If the BIC allows us, can we ask both of you for book recommendations about Japan, because several people have asked for this. Just a couple, if you'd like. And
Pratap, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll say. I think if people haven't read Fumiko Enchi's Masks, I think they should read it. It's an extraordinary novel that doesn't get talked about in the same breath as like the great male Japanese novelists. Pratap?
I think Jane Austen fans, there's Tanazaki. I think the Makioka sisters, like I prefer them to Pride and Prejudice any day. So there's that. There is Endo, who's written Silence. I think that they did a movie out of it. Martin did a movie. Very disturbing, but very profound and moving, and very unusual book also. Sort of set in I think it's in the late 17th century, when you have these Jesuits coming from Portugal at a time when there's persecution of Christians in Japan, but also raises a lot of very interesting questions. How about you, Pratap?
So two things. I mean, Endo definitely, and for the India-Japan connection, of course, he also has another book set in Banaras, which is a sort of I think a deep river, which is also interesting in a very different way. I'll go for a conventional choice, which is Murakami. Pretty much anything. Partly because I think for two reasons, right? I mean, one, because I think he actually encapsulates the contradictoriness of Japan, I think, a lot more. I mean, I think, the kind of all the kind of classic novelists like sort of, Mishima and all, sort of, they're on a mission in some senses. I mean, there's a national story they're telling. Murakami, you can get the sort of the technological utopianism. You can get this sort of, what is fundamentally, I think, this wrestling that, this question that people talked about Japan's relationship to their own past in some senses. I mean, I think he's one of the few novelists who's actually talked about the Japanese invasion of China and Nanjing, I think very, very sort of, openly. There's the kind of complete quirkiness, the inner loneliness in a culture that actually, at some senses, seem quite collective, So in some senses, it just seems a lot more human. It's not on a kind of national mission in some senses to tell a national story, and that can be liberating.
Also, just quickly, as general sort of Japan introduction to what's going on there right now. I think David Pillig's book was all right. It was Bending Adversity. He was the FT foreign correspondent there for many years, and I read it just before I moved to Japan. Found that very helpful as well.
I think, like you, he's a Japan-China man. Amazing. Thank you so much. Don't forget to read Orienting while you're packing your shopping carts with the books that Pallavi and Pratap have recommended. Thank you very much for being with us. And thank you to the BIC and to Pratap, Pavan, and to Pallavi for this.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Supriya, for such a wonderful job with the moderation. Thank you very much.
It was a joy.
Books have always been a gateway to unlimited travel, and thanks to travelers and adventurers like Pallavi, thank you for bringing it to us, those of us who only know about this fascinating culture from popular culture. One knows a sure way of to reflect on one's own sense of self is definitely to reach out and explore others. Thank you to Pratap and Pawan for your time and for your valuable insight, and of course, Supriya for your excellent moderation. Thank you everyone who joined us this evening. And all I have to say now is arigato gozaimasu and nasai. Good night, everyone, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.